Ted did not learn the truth about Sharon and Vernon all at once. It arrived in fragments, like shards of glass cutting deeper with every realization. At first, it was a pattern he could not ignore, discrepancies that refused to align, decisions that made no sense unless viewed through a lens he had never considered. What began as confusion hardened into suspicion, and suspicion slowly transformed into something far more corrosive. By the time the full weight of the secret settled in, the shock had already carved a hollow space inside him, leaving anger and disbelief to echo against one another. The revelation struck at the core of Ted's identity. He had built his sense of self around loyalty, around the belief that trust was not only earned but sacred. Sharon had always represented emotional grounding, someone whose presence suggested stability even when circumstances shifted. Vernon, in contrast, embodied authority and calculation, a figure whose approval carried weight, and whose guidance had once felt unshakable. Discovering that the two of them shared a hidden agenda, one constructed through omission, manipulation, and strategic silence, forced Ted to confront a truth he had spent years refusing to imagine. The people he relied on most had been shaping reality without him. Anger surged first, violent and uncontrollable. It was not merely the anger of betrayal, but the fury of being underestimated. Sharon and Vernon had made decisions that altered lives, reputations, and outcomes, while deliberately keeping Ted in the dark. The implication was unbearable. It suggested that they had never truly trusted him, never believed he could handle the truth, or worse, that he was useful precisely because of his ignorance. That realization stripped him of dignity in a way no public humiliation ever could. Yet anger alone could not sustain him. Beneath it lay a deep, unsettling conflict that threatened to tear him apart. Ted was forced to acknowledge his own complicity, not through action, but through absence. He had accepted explanations without scrutiny, allowed convenience to replace curiosity, and dismissed subtle warning signs because confronting them would have disrupted the fragile harmony he clung to. The secret Sharon and Vernon shared thrived not only because they hid it well, but because Ted had unknowingly provided the conditions that allowed it to exist. Sharon's role cut especially deep. Her motivations, once viewed as selfless or pragmatic, now appeared layered with self-preservation and fear. She had made choices to protect something valuable, perhaps a reputation, perhaps a future she believed would collapse under the weight of truth. Ted understood the instinct, even as it enraged him. That understanding became its own form of torment, forcing him to grapple with the uncomfortable possibility that, placed under the same pressure, he might have acted similarly. The line between victim and accomplice blurred, leaving him suspended in moral uncertainty. Vernon's involvement introduced a different kind of fracture. His actions were colder, more deliberate, driven by a belief that control justified deception. Vernon had calculated outcomes, measured risks, and decided that Ted's ignorance was an acceptable cost. This was not protection, it was management. The realization reframed every past interaction, casting shadows over moments Ted had once interpreted as mentorship or concern. Vernon had not merely withheld the truth, he had engineered circumstances to ensure Ted remained exactly where he was most useful. As the implications expanded, Ted felt himself being cornered by decisions he had not made but now had to answer for. The secret carried consequences that extended beyond personal betrayal. It threatened alliances, exposed vulnerabilities, and risked unraveling structures that rely on public perception. Ted was now entangled in a web of responsibility without consent, forced to choose between exposing the truth and preserving a stability built on lies. Either path demanded sacrifice, and neither offered absolution. The pressure intensified as Ted recognized how deeply Sharon and Vernon's secret intersected with his own life. Their decisions had shaped opportunities he accepted, conflicts he avoided, and judgments he rendered under false pretenses. The past could no longer be separated from the present. Every memory now demanded reevaluation. Trust, once fractured, became impossible to restore without confronting the full extent of the deception. Yet confrontation carried risks that extended far beyond emotional fallout. Internally, Ted oscillated between confrontation and retreat. Part of him craved resolution through exposure, believing that truth, however destructive, was the only path to reclaiming his autonomy. Another part recoiled at the collateral damage such exposure would cause, not only to Sharon and Vernon, but to himself. He was acutely aware that revealing the secret would also reveal his own failure to see it sooner. Pride and principle collided, each demanding dominance. Sharon, though absent from the moment of revelation, loomed large in Ted's thoughts. Her silence was no longer passive. It was active, sustained, and intentional. Ted grappled with the possibility that her affection had been genuine, even as her secrecy was deliberate. That duality unsettled him more than outright malice ever could. It forced him to confront the uncomfortable reality that people could love deeply and betray profoundly at the same time. Vernon's influence proved even harder to escape. His reach extended into systems and relationships Ted depended on, creating a sense of entrapment that fueled resentment. Vernon had positioned himself not just as a participant in the secret, but as its architect, ensuring that any attempt to dismantle it would implicate Ted as well. The imbalance of power was unmistakable, and it left Ted feeling manipulated and exposed. As the tension mounted, Ted's internal conflict began to manifest outwardly. His composure fractured, replaced by sharp reactions and calculated detachment. Those around him sensed the shift, though few understood its cause. Ted became increasingly isolated, caught between the urge to sever ties and the fear of detonating consequences he could not fully control. The secrecy that once excluded him now enclosed him, transforming him into a reluctant guardian of a truth he despised. The moral weight of the situation grew unbearable. Ted was forced to confront the reality that inaction was itself a choice, one that aligned him, however unwillingly, with Sharon and Vernon's deception. Remaining silent preserved the status quo, but eroded his integrity. Speaking out promised chaos, but offered the possibility of reclaiming his sense of self. The decision demanded clarity he struggled to find, as every option carried irreversible consequences. Ultimately, the secret did more than shock Ted. It redefined him. It stripped away illusions of certainty and exposed the fragility of trust in a world governed by ambition and fear. Sharon and Vernon's betrayal did not merely alter relationships. It forced Ted into a reckoning with his own values, revealing the cost of loyalty when it is exploited, and the danger of silence when it becomes complicity. Cornered by truth and constrained by consequence, Ted stood at a precipice shaped by other people's choices. Whether he would emerge hardened or broken remained uncertain. What was clear, however, was that the revelation had already exacted its price. The shock had evolved into something far more dangerous, a quiet resolve forged in anger, disappointment, and the unrelenting need to reclaim control over a life he now realized had never been entirely his own.